Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's April 23rd, and we have a lot to talk about. I'm going to start things off by inviting you to be my guest on the podcast. We're at episode number 87 of Real Talk MS, and as distant as it once seemed, our 100th episode is right around the corner. And I've been trying to come up with something that would make that 100th episode special. But by now, I know you've heard me say that I see this podcast as a two-way conversation. And so many of you have been great when it comes to your side of that conversation. Whether you've sent me a suggestion about a topic that you'd like to hear more about, or offered some feedback on a specific episode of the podcast. Well, I thought what might make that 100th episode of Real Talk MS special is if I have a real conversation, an actual conversation with someone from our listener community. So if you have a story about your MS journey or an interesting perspective on MS that you'd like to share, then I think you and I should talk. All you have to do is visit realtalkms.com/enter, and I'll include that link in today's show notes, and then share some information about what you'd like to talk about during our interview. You have until May 31st to get your entry in. I'll announce the episode 100 special guest winner on the June 4th episode of Real Talk MS, and then we'll get an interview scheduled so that you can share the story of your MS journey with thousands of Real Talk MS listeners in more than 60 countries around the world. So this is your invitation to head over to realtalkms.com/enter and let me know what you'd like to talk about on the podcast. This week, I reached deep into the Real Talk MS vault for my conversation with Dr. Maya Moderich, and we're talking about how socially assistive robots will impact rehabilitation and caregiving. I think that the work that Dr. Moderich is doing will be a game changer for people living with MS and other chronic conditions, as well as for their caregivers. And we're not talking about some science fiction view of the future. Dr. Moderich goes to work every day to create the future. We're talking about technology that exists today and will start appearing in our homes tomorrow. And while it may not literally be tomorrow, it is right around the corner. Dr. Moderich has been named one of the 25 most powerful women in technology and one of the top 25 women in robotics. So I hope you're as excited as I am to hear from her. But before we get to our conversation with Dr. Moderich, there are a few other things that you should know about. I tend to spend a lot of time talking about MS research, and I guess it's because I believe that research is what drives discovery, and discovery drives progress and fuels hope. So I find this announcement to be very good news. The National MS Society announced that it was investing $24.4 million in 64 new MS research projects. And included in these 64 new projects are 14 high-risk pilot research grants. Now, these pilot research grants are specifically designed to quickly test novel concepts and ideas. Before an investigator can receive funding to pursue a new cutting-edge idea, they need to gather some preliminary data that will either lead to gaining that long-term funding for the project or putting the idea to rest. You can kind of think of this stage in research as the proof of concept stage. And these pilot research grants allow investigators to do exactly that. Prove that a research concept has real scientific validity and is worth pursuing on a larger long-term scale. Now, among the 14 pilot projects that have been funded is research that can lead to developing novel therapeutics that promote myelin repair. Another project is attempting to determine whether prebiotics or probiotics have an impact on gut bacteria. And because scientists understand that gut bacteria affects our immune system, this could lead to potentially identifying a dietary supplement that could reduce MS disease activity and symptoms. Another one of these pilot projects will test whether practicing Tai Chi or mindfulness meditation can better improve physical balance and balance competence in people living with MS. And still another pilot project will test the effectiveness of using virtual reality to better manage MS-related pain. Now, these are just a few of the 14 high-risk pilot studies that are part of this portfolio of 64 new MS research projects. And if you'd like to review any or all of these projects in more detail, I'll include a link to the full listing, description, and details of each of them in today's show notes. This year alone, the MS Society will provide support for 340 new and ongoing MS research projects. And since this is Walk MS and Bike MS season, it's worth pointing out that the funds raised in these kinds of events allow the MS Society to invest in the research that's going to lead us to better treatments for MS and eventually a cure for MS. Speaking of how scientific discovery drives progress and fuels hope, we know that multiple sclerosis is a demyelinating disease. In other words, the protective myelin sheath that surrounds nerve fibers in our central nervous system is stripped away, and those nerve fibers begin to lose their ability to conduct signals through the central nervous system. And today, there is no drug that will remyelinate those demyelinated nerve fibers. However, a research team at Oregon Health and Science University is claiming to have made a discovery that will ultimately change all that. This story actually begins more than 20 years ago when Dr. Tom Scanlon, a professor of physiology and pharmacology at the Oregon Health and Sciences University School of Medicine, developed a synthetic molecule called sobeterome, and that was designed to lower cholesterol. And by the way, you have my apologies if I'm getting that pronunciation wrong. Now, scientists have known that myelin can be regrown through exposure to high levels of thyroid hormones. Unfortunately, chronic exposure to high levels of thyroid hormones carries with it very serious side effects, so thyroid hormone therapy isn't considered safe for humans. But 6 years ago, Dr. Dennis Bourdette, the chair of neurology at the Oregon Health and Sciences University School of Medicine and the director of its Multiple Sclerosis Center, suggested that they should look at sobeterome as a compound that could mimic the remyelinating characteristic of thyroid hormones without the harmful side effects. Well, with funding from the National Institutes of Health, the National MS Society, the Race to Erase MS, and Oregon Health and Science University's own Laura Fund, the research team began experimenting using sobeterome to treat mice that had been genetically engineered to mimic MS. One of their goals was to devise a way to increase the amount of sobeterome that could penetrate the blood-brain barrier. And the team was able to accomplish this by adding a tag that altered or disguised the sobeterome molecule so that it could sort of fool the blood-brain barrier. And once this now altered sobeterome molecule gets past the blood-brain barrier, an enzyme in the brain naturally strips the tag away and converts the altered molecule back to sobeterome. You can think of this as the biomolecular version of a Trojan horse. Well, researchers found that the sobeterome treatment in mice that had been genetically engineered to mimic MS not only triggered myelin repair, but also produced substantial motor improvements in the mice, leading to almost full recovery. The research team expects that it's going to be a few years before their sobeterome compound is ready for human clinical trials, but they feel confident that it can produce the same outcome in humans. We know there's a huge difference between a mouse brain and a human brain, but the biological mechanisms involved here may prove to be consistent. So with cautious optimism, let's see what happens in the clinical trials that will eventually follow this breakthrough announcement. And we'll see if science has perhaps found the key to a process that will produce safe remyelination and motor skills improvement in people living with MS. Now, if you're interested in reviewing the details of this research, I'll include a link to the study results in today's show notes. We often talk about being able to live your best life with MS, and I want to let you know about some amazing resources that are available from the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation, and these are resources that can make it easier to live your best life. For instance, we know that heat can exacerbate some MS symptoms, and as we head into the warm summer months, being able to get outside and enjoy life can sometimes be challenging if you're living with MS. Well, the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation has a cooling program that provides a variety of items like cooling vests, neck wraps, and wristbands, absolutely free of charge. We also know that living with MS can lead to feelings of social isolation. And a great way to overcome feeling isolated is to connect with others. Now, technology has given us easy and accessible ways to connect with family, friends, support resources, and really the rest of the world. But you need access to a computer to easily make those connections. And there are people on limited or fixed incomes who are living with MS who may not have the funds for a computer. Well, the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation has a computer program that will provide a laptop or desktop PC complete with monitor, keyboard, and mouse to individuals with MS who are living on limited or fixed incomes. These are amazing resources that can easily change someone's quality of life. They can make it possible and safe for you to get outside and enjoy the summer, or stay indoors and connect with family, friends, and almost unlimited entertainment and information resources that are available online. And I'll include a link to the online application for both the MS Foundation's cooling program and computer program in today's show notes. Speaking of really remarkable resources, a couple of weeks ago, the MS International Federation hosted an amazing webinar titled Solving Progressive MS, Progress Achieved and Hope for the Future. The webinar was hosted by Stuart Nixon, and I had the pleasure of talking with Stuart on the podcast last year. Stuart is the co-chair of the UK MS Society's Scientific Research Strategy Committee and a recognized global advocate for ensuring people affected by MS get the support they need in order to live their best lives. Stuart was joined by a panel of experts that you'd be hard-pressed to match anywhere in the world, including Professor Alan Thompson, the chair of the Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee and Dean of the Faculty of Brain Sciences at University College London, Professor Jenny Freeman, a professor of physiotherapy and rehabilitation at the University of Plymouth in the United Kingdom, and Professor Giancarlo Comi, co-chair of the Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee and chair of the Department of Clinical Neurophysiology and director of the Institute of Experimental Neurology at the Scientific Institute San Raffaele in Milan, Italy. This discussion of the state of progressive MS research, the work that's being done by the Progressive MS Alliance, and the next steps that need to be taken to develop breakthrough treatments for progressive MS was truly a can't-miss event. But in the event that you did manage to miss it, I'm going to include a link to the video replay in today's show notes. And if you or a family member are living with progressive MS, you need to schedule time to watch this video. Because once you have an understanding of the increasing velocity of scientific discovery and you hear from these experts about how science is advancing our understanding of progressive MS, you can't help but feel a little bit more hopeful. I I know that there's a high level of interest in stem cell therapy for MS, and I try to make sure that we spend a fair amount of time talking about it on the podcast. We've talked about the number of shady operators running so-called stem cell clinics that make great sounding promises, but are basically designed to separate as much money as possible from each patient while delivering very little, if anything, in the way of results. And we've also talked about the stem cell clinical trials that are underway in research centers across the United States. Today, I want to tell you about Gray Doherty, a nurse at Wolfson Children's Hospital in Jacksonville, Florida. Gray is living with MS, and she's qualified to be a part of the hematopoietic stem cell transplantation clinical trial being conducted at Northwestern University. And what makes Gray Doherty's story so interesting is that she elected to have her stem cell transplant done live on Facebook. So if you've ever wondered what that phase of the treatment is like, you'll find a link in today's show notes to the TV news story about Gray's procedure, and that story includes the video of her stem cell transplant that was initially broadcast live on Facebook. I'll also mention that this particular clinical trial requires not only that the patient can medically qualify for the stem cell treatment, but that they're able to pay the $125,000 cost of the procedure. In Gray Doherty's very fortunate case, her insurance covered the cost of the stem cell treatment that she received. If you'd like to jump onto the other side of the examining table and get a taste of what doctors think about and talk about when it comes to diagnosing and treating MS, you might want to check out a free video series that was just made available online by Neurology Live. It's called Advances in the Diagnosis and Treatment of Multiple Sclerosis, and the 16-episode series features a panel of clinical experts discussing a variety of topics ranging from new criteria for diagnosing MS to treatment options, symptom management, and a lot more. Keep in mind that physicians are the intended audience for these videos, which each run only about 5 or 6 minutes. But if you'd like to gain some insights that will make you a more informed medical consumer, then this video series is certainly worth watching, and I'll include a link to the series in today's show notes. In a moment, we're going to be talking about how socially assistive robots can be game changers when it comes to MS rehabilitation and MS caregiving with my guest, Dr. Maya Moderick. I'm excited to have as my guest today Dr. Maya Moderick. Dr. Moderick is not a neurologist, but I'm convinced that the work that Dr. Moderick is doing has the potential to change the face of neurological rehabilitation and even long-term care for people living with any number of conditions, including multiple sclerosis. And I think it may also redefine caregiving for family members who are caring for a loved one at home. Dr. Moderick is a professor and the Chan Soon Shong Chair in the Computer Science Department, Neuroscience Program in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Southern California. She's the founding director of the USC Robotics and Autonomous Systems Center, the co-director of the USC Robotics Research Lab, and vice dean for research at the Viterbi School of Engineering at USC. Dr. Moderick is a recipient of the 2009 Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics, and Engineering Mentoring. She was named one of the 25 most powerful women in technology and one of the top 25 women in robotics. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Moderick.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, sure. As I said, I am thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to you today because I believe your work is going to make a real difference for so many people. And I guess we should jump in at the beginning. I'm hoping you can explain to my listeners what a socially assistive robot is.
Well, about 15 years ago or so, I was looking around at where robotics would make the most difference. And it's kind of an interesting thing to contemplate now because robotics is booming and most people are aware that there's a boom in robotics, but it's not clear how it'll affect them directly other than maybe through, autonomous driving or maybe autonomous delivery through drones, etc. And when I looked at the field 15 years ago, I was particularly interested in looking at special needs populations. So I wanted to see where can robots make a difference in daily lives of people who actually need assistance, as opposed to sort of more luxurious, opportunistic applications like autonomous driving and flying. And so I'm happy to say that in parallel with this boom in robotics we've had for about 15 years, development and piloting of autonomous robotic systems, which are trying to assist people in helping them meet their own, usually health-related and educational goals. So socially assistive robots are robots that help people through social interaction rather than physical help. And that's really interesting because when you think about robots, you think about machines that do physical work. Actually, the word robot comes from the Czech rabota, which means menial labor, right? So it's all about kind of original physical work, whether it's on an assembly line or driving people around, but it's something physical, fetching and delivering. And what we found by looking at a lot of literature and then talking to a lot of people in healthcare and special needs more generally, was that what people needed was not so much to have someone else do work for them or something else do the work for them, but to find the strength, and by that I don't mean so much physical as psychological, emotional, motivation, drive to help themselves when they're facing some incredibly hard challenge, whether it's rehab, whether it's any kind of developmental or aging-related challenge. And so that's where we found a niche. And we said, well, okay, so a lot of people need a lot of help. What does robotics have to do with it? And the really interesting thing about neuroscience is that it shows in the last about 15, 20 years, there's this field of embodiment, neuroscience of embodiment. And it shows us that the way we're wired as physical creatures really determines how we interact socially and what affects our health. So it turns out that we are physical social creatures, and our physical social interactions drive our health and our motivation more than anything else. And so that's this foundation of the field of socially assisted robotics, is the idea that these robots help you get better by being your social peer in the physical world. They have to be physical and they have to be social.
So I'm someone who maybe has been treated in a hospital and has been discharged, and I have some rehabilitation to do. My disability makes it especially difficult for me to get to the place where I need to do that rehab work, and this happens quite often, actually. So given that, can a socially assistive robot be in my home helping me through doing some of the physical therapy work, things like that?
So, indeed, the point of the the point of the socially assistive robot is to help you overcome challenges that relate to whether you have the motivation to do the work that you're supposed to be doing. Like maybe you have to do some number of exercises per day or some amount of time, and that ends up being difficult to do. You somehow find yourself not doing it because you're too busy or you get distracted, and these are all implicit psychological reasons that we avoid doing things that are very challenging. So what the robot does is it doesn't physically get you anywhere. That's not its role. For that, you can use an autonomous car, right, or some other type of transportation. What it's about more is getting you physically to do, for you to physically do what you are doing, whether it's because it's so psychologically difficult, it's so challenging, it's demoralizing, it's depressing. Let me give you an example from our early work. One of the areas of our very early work was in stroke rehabilitation. And we looked at what challenges stroke patients had in rehab. And in order to regain function that you have lost or even partially get better, you have to do a lot of activities of daily life with your affected limb. And that's very demoralizing, right? Because if I want to reach, let's say, for the coffee mug with my stroke-affected limb, I'm going to have a lot of trouble doing that. I might drop it. I'm certainly going to look really disabled to anyone observing me. So there's a lot of stigma and dissatisfaction in doing that. Whereas I could just use my other limb, let's say my left arm, which isn't stroke affected, and then nobody will know anything except I will not recover. So there's this really challenging problem, which is not that people who are not doing activities of daily life with their stroke affected limb are being lazy. It's that it is downright demoralizing and depressing to do rehabilitation exercises. So how do we get people motivated? How do we give them the emotional support and the social support to help themselves through a process which is inherently depressing and isolating? That's what we're trying to get at. But if you don't have a wonderful friend who's going to be with you 24/7 to support you in this journey of recovery, then at least you can have a socially assisted robot who's going to be a companion to assist you in this recovery process. That's the point.
I'm wondering, can that robot remind me if I need to take medication?
So the robot can certainly remind you, and in fact, reminder systems are becoming more ubiquitous, but reminding someone to do what they need to do is not a very effective way to do it. So most people who don't do what they need to do are not doing it not because they forgot. They even might believe that they forgot, but they actually don't want to do it. And why don't they want to do it? Well, because it's really challenging. It's challenging for a variety of reasons, emotionally, psychologically, cognitively. It's challenging. So it isn't about, it's like medication adherence. Medication adherence is a great example where people have been thinking for years and years how to make a smart pill box, which is going to nudge you and nag you to take the right pill. Well, I have a mother who is now 83 years old, and when she needed to take an extra pill, and she's quite healthy, fortunately, but when she, had some number of pills that she was taking to regulate blood pressure, whatever, and then she had to take another one, let's say for her thyroid, she said, well, I don't want to take that extra one. That makes me feel old. So there are all sorts of psychological reasons why we have issues with adhering to medical regimens. And taking medication, every time you take a medication, you are reminded that there's something wrong with it. So that's a part of the reason why people don't take medication. And it's important to understand that it isn't about forgetting. It's not about just telling them what time of day it is. It's like saying, if I remind you not to eat fatty food and I remind you that exercise is healthy, then you're going to not eat fatty food and exercise more. Has
Right.
that ever worked?
And not so much.
That's the point. So that's the point. The point is that behavior change is really challenging, and we have to have the motivation to help ourselves. And there's a lot of neuroscience to back that any kind of behavior change, whether it's rehabilitation from a physical disability all the way to brain implant patients, we need to want to make something happen. You have to have that volitional drive that is driving your behavior in your brain. And to make that happen, well, why are you going to want to do something if you might feel isolated, depressed, or disabled? That's where the social factors come in, to give us support to make us change what we need to change.
So it sounds like you get a new best friend when you get a socially assistive robot.
Well, you definitely get a friend. One hopes that there's always one or more human best friends. But, the human support system is complex. For people with disabilities and special needs, there's always the loneliness of, a variety of social factors, in fact, including being ostracized. I work a lot with the autism population. And so I think what we're trying to say here is we're not trying to replace human friends, but we're trying to bridge the gap in care. Everyone deserves the best of care. And this is a way to fill in what is missing.
Well, I think that might even have a secondary benefit to the humans who are providing care, in the sense that they're going to feel a little less overwhelmed and maybe a little less, a few less cases of caregiver burnout over time.
Well, thank you for saying that. That is exactly our goal. And if you look at it from the outside and don't really understand the bigger picture, then there might be fear that we're talking about job displacement. And we really aren't trying to displace human caregivers, because the need for human caregivers is vast, but there's just not enough people who are available and trained and properly compensated to do that work. And so this is absolutely bridging the gap and helping them, not taking them out of the picture.
What are the costs associated with a socially assistive robot, or is it even too soon to be able to estimate what those might be?
I don't think it's too soon, and I think, in fact, the costs are much lower than anybody would anticipate. I think now, if you think about producing machines that have to manipulate the world, that's expensive, right? So if you want me to take a person with a physical disability and pick them up and carry them safely across the room, that is very expensive. But if you want to have a robot that sits next to you, sort of watches, observes your facial expressions, maybe takes some physiologic data at the same time, encourages you to do things, knows things about you, helps you along, for it can be much more affordable for the users. In a matter of the next few years, literally 2, 3, 4 years, we're going to be seeing more and more companies deploying these kinds of products into people's homes. And initially, the products won't be particularly useful, but they're going to build. And so very soon, we're actually going to have these things which will start to be covered by insurance, and they will not be that expensive. It'll be, say, let's say the cost of a cell phone or a laptop, right? So that's not very much. We're not talking about tens of thousands of dollars now on affordable kinds of systems. We're talking about at the level of a cell phone or a laptop, which is still not super cheap for all populations. It's not for every demographic yet. But if you consider the penetration of cell phones, this is not that different.
That's remarkable. Back in the 1990s, I felt pretty certain that I'd be piloting my flying car by now. And unfortunately, that still hasn't happened, especially when I'm trying to traverse LA traffic. But, on a more serious note, when it comes to starting to see socially assistive robots in our homes, it sounds like that is much, much more within our grasp today.
It is. That's a really good comparison you make, because today, if you want to have an autonomous car, you have to pay quite a bit, because the very high-end vehicles are partially autonomous. They're not fully autonomous, but you could buy a very high-end vehicle, or not, well, it depends what people consider high-end, but for about $100,000 and up, you can get cars that are partially autonomous. But that's not particularly accessible, right? And affordable. Whereas with socially assistive robotics, as I said, the entry-level systems are going to be much more affordable. Then the question becomes, how general purpose are they? But there have already been apps that have started to show people how to do some types of behavior change. So, for example, I'm going to pick out Headspace for meditation and kind of, sleep management and anxiety. So that's a wonderful example of a low-cost technology, and some level of service is even free, that is available on your phone. Now, it doesn't work for a lot of people, and adherence is a big issue, etc. But it does work for some, and like I said, it's accessible and affordable. So now if you think of a step up where you have a social companion that helps you with that kind of thing, that is on the order of, a cost of a laptop, that is, much, much more affordable for so many more people. And then people are starting to develop all kinds of software. It's interesting, people are developing software for interactive agents already, and they're doing it for entertainment purposes, but this will all get leveraged for health purposes as well. So it's a really good alignment to technology development.
Wow, it sounds amazing, and yet it sounds like it's literally springing up around us as we speak. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. I really appreciate it. I know it's going to get a lot of our listeners thinking about things that they may not have considered before when they thought about things like rehabilitation and caregiving and what the next steps might be. So thank you for everything you do, and certainly for spending a few minutes with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it feels like we've covered a lot of ground today, and that's a pretty good thing. It means that there's a lot going on that will help move the ball down the field in advancing our understanding of MS and identifying better treatments and ultimately a cure. So that's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. I hope you take just a couple of minutes this week to let me know why you'd be the perfect special guest for me to interview on our 100th episode. Just head over to realtalkms.com/enter. And we might be having a conversation on Real Talk MS episode number 100. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.